Looking back on the abuse I suffered as a child is difficult. Not simply because of the impact it had on me all those years later, but also because of how patchy said memories can be. I actually have pretty good memory of much of my childhood. So much in fact that during the summer between finishing school and starting college, my dad actually took me on a holiday to the Shetlands, which is where my first strong memories originate. I kind of feel bad because whilst I loved everything we saw, I still wasn't much of a hiker at the time and couldn't stay out for as long as I know he would have liked to have done. I'd grown up there for a couple of years due to my dad being an engineer in the RAF. Once his posting up there was over, we all moved down to Odium, which is where both my parents realised that, whilst they still cared for one another, it wasn't in a romantic sense and they decided to part ways. My dad then went on to be stationed elsewhere, such as Gibraltar and the Falklands, whilst my mum moved to a town near Odium with me and my brother. I can't even begin to imagine how my mum must have felt at the time. You see, my mum's Dutch. She comes from part of the Netherlands on the Dutch-German border and had moved to the UK when she was younger, before settling down. All of our Dutch family still live in the Netherlands, and she'd of course been used to moving place to place with my father's postings, meaning that her good friends were cast far and wide. I can only begin to imagine that my mum must have felt pretty isolated. I also know that she didn't particularly like where we were living at the time. We'd moved into a tower block apartment. If you saw the news on the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017, that's not too far from what we were living in. That's when he came into the picture. I don't actually know his name. It's one of those things I don't have a memory of. And I get that some of you are most likely wondering why I haven't asked my mum about it. The fact is, I haven't felt I have cause to do so. Knowing his name will in no way lessen what happened to us as a family. All asking would do is make my mum relive what he did, and considering how I reacted in reliving my own trauma, I don't feel I have the right to do that to her. What I do remember is how friendly he was. He must have seemed like the perfect guy to my mum. Not only was he interested in her, but he showed a key interest in both myself and my brother. And it wasn't exactly hard to win us over either. I mean, I was like 4 at the time, and Walking with Dinosaurs had just come out on TV, and guess who was nice enough to record it and give me a copy of the tape when they first visited our flat? They were keen for us to move in, and my mum was a little worried about our current situation. Some of our neighbours were nice enough, others... In 2011, when I finally talked to my mum, she revealed that she had her suspicions that one of the neighbours was abusing his wife. And that's the tragic irony about abuse, isn't it? It's always easier to see in those around you than it is to see it when you're the victim. People say that they'd never let it happen to them, that they'd spot the warning signs and get out. I guess my mum thought that as well back then. I don't know how quickly things turned bad. What I do remember were the nights when he'd start to yell. I don't know what it was about or what had caused it. As a child, all I could understand were the facts that this was a rage like I'd never heard before, and that when my mum was finally allowed to come up the stairs to calm both myself and my brother down, who were in tears by just how brutal he was with his voice, something was up. My mum is typically strong, opinionated, and outgoing, but when she came up, she wasn't her usual self, but an echo of the person she normally was. Whilst we were stood in the middle of the field in the Netherlands in 2011, my mum talked to me about the way in which things had started out nice enough. He came from a rather well-off background, and his son was away serving in the military, I believe. He had a completely detached house in a quaint village-style area with a row of massive fir trees growing in the back garden. The house itself wasn't especially large, but I remember my mum seemed happy when we first moved there. I remember spending time at a nearby river, watching the wasps visiting the mud banks to drink and look for any food washed up. However, things quickly changed. It turned out that his interest in both myself and my brother did not come from some empathetic extension of his feelings for our mum, but rather a deep-rooted possessiveness. When we moved in, he saw that as a sign that we were now his property. This led him to do everything he felt he could within reason to distance myself and my brother from our respective fathers, going as far as to destroy photographs of them he could identify. I remember recalling this detail when my mum got out the family photos to show Udita, who didn't know this detail of the abuse at that time. Later that night, I pointed out how the only photos my mum could really show her of my dad at the time were the ones where he was dressed up as Ozzy Osbourne for a Halloween party with comic relief sunglasses to match. I assumed our abuser hadn't recognised my father under the black wig and sunglasses, so they'd been spared his attempts to remove all traces of what he saw as competition. In his mind, we were to have no other fathers before him. Yet as much as he felt he owned us, he seemed to feel no compassion for us. I remember falling ill one time and throwing up in my bed. My mum came up and moved me downstairs while she was cleaning up. She laid me down on the sofa and gave me a glass of flat Coke. It was one of those homebrewed remedies that was supposed to help you rehydrate after you've just thrown up, almost like rehydration salts. I don't think it actually works, but I just remember it. Anyway, within a couple of minutes he came into the room, sat in the spare chair, and I shit you not, turned the TV on and started watching Alien 3. I remember the dog exploding and laying there, too terrified to turn away before I couldn't handle it any longer. I just remember pleading for him to turn it off. And this is one of the few direct interactions I can remember having with him. His tone when he responded was cold. He told me he wasn't going to do anything, and if I couldn't handle it, I should just go back to bed. So that's exactly what I did. I went upstairs and I lay on the bare mattress, still able to feel the wet patch where my mum had wiped it down. I get that this may not sound particularly bad, but I was 5 years old, ill, and watching a chestburster rip its way out of a dog. Meanwhile, I can't remember a single kind act on his part. Ever. But that's nowhere as near as bad as what he began to do to my mum. He worked on eroding her sense of self-worth. He ate at her confidence, telling her that she was getting old, that she was undesirable, that nobody would ever dare touch a woman with 2 children. She explained to me in 2011 that in time, she began to believe it. My mum began to see herself as lesser. He was just a saint doing his part, martyring himself simply by being with her. And part of that were his conditions. Apparently he began to tighten his hold over every aspect of my mum's life. Going out with her friends became restricted by him. He'd make accusations if he thought any men were going to be present, whether or not that was in fact the case. From what she described to me in the field in 2011, it seemed that he wanted every hour of my mum's time to be for him and him alone. Devaluing and isolating a victim are 2 common components of domestic abuse. If a victim feels that to leave their abuser would inflict more harm than staying, and they feel that they have nobody they can really turn to, that situation can hold them in submission indefinitely. Given time, this chokehold can become seen as the state of life, the norm which doesn't deserve challenge. Thankfully, my mum made it out, but it was by pure fluke. As we continued talking in the middle of the field in 2011, my mum explained that during one of the times where my mum was allowed upstairs to calm us down, one of us said something. One of us told her that we were terrified that if she went back downstairs, we would never see her again. That's when she became consciously aware of just how bad the situation was and how it was worsening. she contacted Women's Refuge and we moved out. And I wish that's where this video could end, but it's not. There was a detail that I couldn't bring up with my mum in 2011. In fact, it would take me many years to do so. But before I go any further, I need to be absolutely clear in my position on domestic violence refuges. They have a vital part to play in supporting those who have suffered said abuse. What happened to myself and my brother was tragic and never should have occurred. But that fact does not then devalue the devotion and hard work put in by volunteers everywhere who run such establishments. Yes, we should always strive to improve our social systems, but to demand perfection in 100% of cases is unreasonable. Seatbelts don't save every person involved in a car crash, and just as nobody would use that fact to claim that seatbelts are a waste of resources, nobody should use the same logic to claim that about shelters. The reason I didn't tell my mum the whole story back then was twofold. Part of me didn't feel it right to firstly talk to him about the domestic abuse and how we'd escaped it, only to then spring on her the facts that inside the shelter, both myself and my brother went on to experience sexual assault. My mum risked everything in escaping her abuser. There were 1,000 ways it could have gone south, and yet she had the immense fortitude to go through with it, breaking through numerous psychological prisons her abuser had constructed. And she had no way of knowing that the place she'd been told was safe actually contained another former predator. I couldn't tell her at the time because I didn't want to hurt her or burden her with that. Then there was the fact that I was both terrified and ashamed. The sexual abuse which had occurred inside the refuge hadn't been straightforward, which I imagine sounds wrong to hear. What I mean is that our abuser didn't touch either myself or my brother themselves. Instead, they cheered me on as they got me to do things to my brother who was held down, cheering me on like it was a game. And I know it's not my fault. I was 5 or 6 years of age at the time and had no idea as to the severity of what I was doing. But that's the horror of it. When I remember it, what I did, I don't remember it in the mindset I had back then. When I see what I did in my head, I do so with the knowledge offered by hindsight. It's as if someone is forcing me to watch a TV screen with the recording of what happened, having made it so I can never turn my head away, never close my eyes. There's also no way for me to change what happened, no matter how much I wish I could. In the end, we moved out of the refuge and into council housing in 2001, less than 2 years after we left the flat to move in with him. I was able to work this out using the fact that I remember watching Monsters Inc. in the Robin Cinema in Camberley, as well as adopting our cat Jazz before I went to see my family in Norway. Walking with Beasts, the follow-up to Walking with Dinosaurs, was starting whilst I was away, so my mum recorded it. When I got back, she told me that Jazz had been particularly interested in the Leptictidium from the first episode. But looking back, I find it hard to grasp just how quickly everything progressed. To me, what happened seemed to span far longer than what I've actually been able to piece together. These are perhaps the memories I feel least comfortable going over in detail due to their very patched nature. But it's an important part to tell in going over my mental health story. It's been more than a year since I finally approached my brother and then my mum over what had happened in the refuge. I remember sitting my mum down at the end of my bed whilst I sat there talking to her. I described what had happened and why I'd kept it from her until then. She seemed to understand. We talked for a while about several things before finally embracing one another, me telling her that she'd done everything she could have for me and my brother, and her telling me that I wasn't to blame for what an adult had made me do as a child.